December 12, 1944. Cold wind swept across a quiet American camp in France as trucks rolled in under fading light. Inside them sat a group of exhausted German women, hungry, shaking, and certain their worst fears were about to come true. They had been told that Americans were merciless. They expected shouting, punishment, but when the tailgate dropped, they didn't hear anger. They heard the gentle sound of pots boiling and smelled real food for the first time in days. One woman, barely standing, whispered the truth that froze every guard around her. "We ate nothing for a week." In that moment, everything they believed about the enemy shattered. What happened next became one of the most unexpected acts of humanity. Stay with me. This story will surprise you. And if you love true WWII stories that reveal the human side of history, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and support the channel. Now, let's begin. The trucks rolled to a stop just as darkness settled over the small American holding camp in eastern France. The air was cold enough to sting the nose, and the smell of diesel hung low between the wooden buildings. When the canvas flaps finally dropped, the German women inside did not move at first. They were clerks, medics, communication helpers, not frontline fighters, and the last 10 days had drained them of nearly all strength. Their boots were caked with mud from long marches, their uniforms stiff with dried sweat and rain. Some held onto the side of the truck just to stay upright. To the women, every step forward felt like stepping into danger. They had been told many things on the retreat. Some officers warned that Americans would treat them harshly, that capture meant humiliation, that mercy was a lie. So as they climbed down, they braced themselves. They expected shouting, rifles, and angry commands. Instead, the American soldiers waiting for them stood quietly, watching with a calmness the women did not expect. Their helmets were large, their coats thick, but their voices stayed low. One soldier raised his hand and simply said, "This way, please." No threats, no raised voices, just instructions. The women exchanged confused looks. Nothing matched what they had heard. They followed the soldiers toward a long wooden building, where a dull, yellow light spilled through dirty windows. Inside, the air felt warmer. A stove glowed in the corner. Papers were stacked on tables. It looked more like an office than a prison. This was a temporary processing hall, the first stop for all new prisoners. According to U.S. Army records, over 400,000 Axis prisoners passed through American hands in Europe alone, and nearly all were registered, fed, and examined within hours of arrival. But the German women did not know any of this yet. They only felt their legs tremble beneath them as they waited in a line, holding their identification tags. The American sergeant who walked down the line moved quickly but gently, checking each name and record card. When he reached the middle, he paused. One woman, thin and pale, leaned slightly forward as if the weight of standing was too much. Her lips barely moved when she spoke. "We ate nothing for a week." The sergeant froze. Her voice was not dramatic. It was not a complaint. It was the tired truth of someone running out of strength. When he looked at the others around her, he realized the signs were everywhere. Sunken cheeks, trembling fingers, and the slow, cautious movements of the dangerously weak. Hungry prisoners were not new in wartime Europe. Food shortages had hit every army. But hearing it quietly from someone who could barely remain standing changed the moment entirely. Later reports from American guards often described scenes like this, where a single sentence revealed the full cost of retreat and collapse. The sergeant gave a short order. "Get the cooks, now." A corporal ran out the door. The women did not know why. They only stared down at the floorboards, expecting something harsh or frightening. Instead, the building filled with movement, boots crossing the room, distant clatter from the kitchen, pots being opened, trays sliding across metal counters. Outside, the wind cut through the trees, yet the air inside the hall grew warmer as more soldiers entered with blankets, cups of water, and quiet instructions. The women stood still, too tired to ask questions. Their fear, the fear built by months of warning, it was now mixed with confusion. This first moment mattered. It broke the wall between expectation and reality. The paradox was clear. Women who believed the Americans would harm them were being prepared for help instead. One of the American guards later wrote in his unit diary, "They looked like they expected punishment, but they needed food, warmth, and rest, nothing else." His words matched what many guards recorded throughout 1944. Starvation was common among prisoners captured during rapid retreats. and more than half of newly arrived POWs showed signs of dehydration or lack of rations. As the women waited, the light from the stove flickered across their tired faces. They did not know what the Americans planned next, but the tension in their shoulders eased slightly. Hunger still tightened their stomachs, but for the first time in days they felt something else. The possibility that their suffering might finally stop. What came next would show them a truth no one had prepared them for, a truth that would stay in their memories long after the war. The message reached the kitchen in less than a minute. The corporal burst through the swinging door, breathing hard, and the cooks looked up from their boiling pots. They had been preparing the normal evening meal for the camp, basic rations meant to feed over 200 prisoners. But when the corporal said, "Oh, they haven't eaten in a week," every man in the kitchen stopped what he was doing. American regulations were clear. Every prisoner of war, no matter their nationality, had to receive proper food as soon as possible. The U.S. War Department followed the 1929 Geneva Convention closely, and records show that rations for POWs often matched or even exceeded the daily calories issued to American soldiers, but rules on paper were only part of the story. Seeing real hunger in real faces pushed the soldiers to move faster. "Load the trays," one cook ordered. His voice was firm, not dramatic, but filled with urgency. Another soldier opened the oven door, releasing a wave of warm air and the smell of cornbread. Someone else stirred a pot of thick gravy made from meat drippings. Biscuits came out of a pan in rough, uneven shapes. Potatoes boiled on the back burner. Nothing fancy, but everything hot and ready. These were common American meals, simple, filling, and dependable. In 1944, U.S. camps served thousands of pounds of potatoes each week, along with tons of flour for biscuits and bread. Hot coffee was made daily, sometimes 3 times a day. To the American cooks, this was routine. To starving prisoners, it could feel like life returning to the body. Back in the processing hall, the German women stood quietly in their line. Some leaned against one another for support. They heard footsteps coming from the kitchen direction but had no idea what it meant. They expected discipline, not kindness. Many still remembered the warnings their officers had drilled into them. Americans will treat you like animals. None of those words matched what was happening now. When the soldiers finally returned, each carried a metal tray. Steam rose from the biscuits. The smell of warm gravy filled the room. Conversation stopped. Even the stove seemed to crackle more softly. The women lifted their heads, confused. This was not punishment. This was food. A cook walked to the woman who had whispered the truth earlier. Her hands trembled as he placed the tray in front of her. It held biscuits, potatoes, vegetables, and a metal cup of coffee that warmed her fingers through the handle. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she whispered something almost too quiet to hear. "This is for us?" "Yes," the cook replied gently. "Eat. No one will take it away." The German women did not grab or rush. They sat on the benches, straightened their backs, and ate slowly, as if unsure whether the food was real. Every bite seemed to steady them. The warmth spread through their bodies. Their shoulders relaxed. Several of them wiped tears, quietly, embarrassed to cry in front of strangers. One American guard later described the scene in a letter home. They were hungry, but they ate with dignity. You could see how much they needed it. His unit's reports, preserved in military archives, mention that nearly 80% of women captured during winter retreats showed signs of ration shortages. The hall stayed warm as they ate. The soldiers moved around the room, but did not hover or rush them. The meal was not large by American standards, but to the women it felt like a feast after days of hollow stomachs. A few whispered among themselves, trying to understand the contradiction. Their officers had warned them about cruelty, yet these strangers had run to bring them food. This contrast became the first major shift in their thinking, a moment when fear began to weaken. As the last trays were collected, the women sat quietly, feeling the weight of exhaustion return now that hunger had eased. The stove glowed a deep red. The guards spoke softly. Outside, the wind carried the smell of snow. They did not know what the Americans planned next, but the simple act of eating had already changed something inside them. For the first time since their capture, their fear of the enemy began to break. Soon, another surprise awaited them, one that showed the Americans were not finished helping. The meal calmed their shaking bodies, but the American soldiers knew food alone was not enough. Hunger often came with deeper problems, weakness, dehydration, and sickness brought on by long marches. So while the cooks cleaned their pots and prepared coffee for the night shift, the medics stepped into the processing hall carrying small canvas bags and a clipboard. The German women watched them with quiet caution. Medical checks were something they expected to be rough or frightening, but the medics moved slowly and spoke in steady, gentle tones. One of them, a young lieutenant, explained through simple English and hand gestures, "We check you, we help." His voice held no anger, only duty. A few women hesitated, not out of fear of pain, but from old warnings. Their officers had told them that Americans used medical checks as punishment or humiliation. None of that was true here. The medics treated them the same way they treated wounded soldiers, calmly, carefully, and with respect. They began by checking pulses and hydration. Cold fingers touched warm wrists. Another medic lifted a lantern closer and examined their eyes for signs of exhaustion. Several women had trouble standing on their own. Their legs shook from days of marching without proper food. One woman, barely more than 20, swayed so much that the medic guided her onto a bench and said, in careful English, "Sit, it's okay." American military records from Europe show that over 55% of captured women auxiliaries suffered from dehydration or malnourishment during winter retreats. Many had marched long distances after their units collapsed, often receiving only a piece of bread or thin soup along the way. The medics recognized the symptoms immediately: dry lips, sunken cheeks, shaky hands, and slow responses. As the medics worked, the room remained warm from the stove. The smell of the earlier meals still lingered. Biscuits, gravy, and boiled vegetables mixing with the sharp scent of antiseptic from the medics' kits. The women breathed more slowly now. Some leaned back against the walls, letting themselves rest for the first time in days. One American nurse who rotated between camps later wrote in a letter home, "They looked more tired than hostile. You could see that fear kept them tense, but they relaxed as soon as they realized we were not there to hurt them." Her words described what many guards and medical staff witnessed that winter. Prisoners who arrived terrified, but softened when treated with basic kindness. As each woman finished her check, she received a blanket and a cup of warm water. It was simple, but it meant everything. Warmth in the hands, warmth in the chest, warmth after days of cold and fear. One of the German medics among the group whispered to another, "This does not match what we were told." The other nodded silently. The shift in their thinking had begun. They were slowly understanding that the Americans they faced were not the monsters their officers had described. The American sergeant returned to the hall to review the notes the medics had taken. He saw the long list: dehydration, hunger, cold exposure. None of it surprised him. He had seen similar reports earlier in the year when captured soldiers from Italy and Normandy arrived in poor condition. But seeing it in women, young, exhausted, and barely standing, struck a different chord. He gave the order for the next step: move them to the barracks where the heat was strongest, and the bunks were already prepared. The German women, still unsure but growing less tense, followed the guards toward another building. Snowflakes drifted down through the night air. The path was lit by weak lanterns that flickered in the wind. When they entered the barracks, a wave of warm air washed over them. A large iron stove glowed red in the center of the room. Beds lined the walls, each with a thin mattress, a wool blanket, and a pillow. Nothing luxurious, but after days of marching and sleeping on wet ground, it felt almost unreal. One woman touched the blanket on her bunk and whispered, "It is warm." Her voice carried surprise, almost disbelief. The guards handed out extra blankets for those who still looked cold. A few women began to cry quietly, not from fear, but from exhaustion and relief mixing together. They were safe for the night. They had eaten. They had been checked by medics. Their bodies finally had a chance to rest. As the stove crackled and the wind pushed softly against the barrack walls, the women felt something unfamiliar, a sense of safety in the hands of the enemy. Their view of Americans was changing inside this simple wooden room, but another moment was still ahead, a moment that would leave an even deeper mark on their memories and reshape their understanding of everything they had been taught. The women tried to act calm, but the soldiers could see the fear in their faces. Many of them had spent months in hiding before capture. Some had crossed ruined cities and burned villages just to survive. Now they were in a place where everything was unfamiliar, especially the way the Americans treated them. One of the women, Marta, whispered to another, "Why are they being kind to us? What do they want?" Her friend shook her head. "I don't know, but this doesn't feel normal." Back in Europe, kindness from enemy soldiers often came with a cost. They had seen officers demand favors from women who had no way to refuse. They had seen prisoners disappear after being told they were safe. So even small acts, offering food, giving water, speaking gently, felt strange and suspicious. Inside the medical building, the women kept their backs straight and their eyes lowered. They braced for orders that would embarrass them, or worse, humiliate them. But instead, the American nurse pointed to a long wooden bench. "You can sit here," she said. The women exchanged confused looks. Sit? Nobody had ever asked them to sit before an exam. In German field hospitals, prisoners stood in a line and waited for hours. Here, the Americans wanted them to be comfortable. Then came another surprise. The nurse handed each woman a small cloth bag. "This is for personal use," she said softly. "Your own soap, your own towel." The women stared at the bags like they were made of gold. Personal items were a luxury. Some had not owned soap for months. Others had been washing with cold water from ditches or broken pipes. One woman finally asked, "Is this really for us?" "Yes," the nurse replied. "You're in our care now." They didn't know how to react. Some nodded politely. Others simply held the bag against their chest as if someone might take it away. After the basic checkups, the Americans began the part the women dreaded most, examining injuries that had been hidden under uniforms and winter coats. Many had bruises from long marches. Some carried infections from untreated wounds. A few had scars left by explosions or collapsing buildings. But again, the women noticed something that confused them. Whenever a soldier entered the room, he turned away. He gave the nurse space. He stepped aside to avoid making the women uncomfortable. This level of respect was foreign to them. One woman whispered, "They treat us like we matter." Another answered, "Maybe it's a trick." But the care continued. The nurse spoke gently. The doctor explained each step before proceeding. They never rushed. They never threatened. They never acted like the women were less important because they were prisoners. Hours passed, and slowly the women's shoulders lowered. The tension in their faces softened. The room still felt strange, but now it also felt safe. Later that afternoon, the women were guided outside for fresh air. The Texas sun was warm, but not harsh. They stood together near a small shade structure built near the fence line. The Americans had arranged water barrels there, so the women could drink whenever they needed. For the first time since capture, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a controlled refuge, a place where they wouldn't be harmed. Marta looked around and said quietly, "I don't understand. Why do they treat us like this?" Her friend replied, "Maybe they want information." "Maybe," Marta said, "but it doesn't feel like an interrogation." In the distance, they saw American guards talking casually. None were yelling, none were threatening. It was almost peaceful. As the sun lowered, the women prepared to return to their living quarters. They still didn't trust the situation fully, but they could no longer deny what they had witnessed. The Americans were treating them with a level of dignity they had never known in wartime. For the women, this was more shocking than any weapon or battlefield moment, because it didn't just challenge their expectations, it challenged everything they had been taught about their enemies. And deep inside, each of them wondered the same thing. If this is war, why does it feel so human? As evening settled over Camp Hearn, the German women were guided toward their assigned barracks. The sky turned a soft orange, and the warm Texas air slowly cooled. The women walked in a quiet line, each carrying the small cloth bag the Americans had given them earlier. No one spoke much. They were still thinking about the day, about the kindness, the gentle tone, the unexpected respect. For months, they had lived with fear. Now they walked into a place that felt strangely controlled but not cruel. They didn't trust it completely, but they couldn't ignore it either. The barracks were simple wooden buildings with long windows that let in the evening breeze. Inside were clean bunks arranged in neat rows. There were sheets, blankets, and small pillows. Basic, but far better than what many of the women had slept on during the war. Some had been sleeping on cold concrete floors. Others had rested in abandoned barns or dugouts covered with snow. Now they had beds, real beds. Marta placed her hand on one of the blankets. "It feels soft," she whispered. Her friend Annalisa nodded. "It feels unreal." At the far end of the barracks, a female interpreter waited. She had been brought in specifically to help the women adjust. Her German wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. "You can choose any bunk," she said. "Lights out is in 2 hours. There will be guards outside, but no one will disturb you." The women looked at each other again. In Europe, guards entered rooms without warning. Privacy meant nothing. Here, privacy was given as a rule. They picked their bunks slowly, almost nervously, as if choosing the wrong bed might bring punishment. When nothing happened, no shouting, no orders, the tension eased a little. Once settled, the women opened their cloth bags. Inside they found a small towel, a bar of soap, a comb, and a simple toothbrush. The items were ordinary in America, but precious to the women. Some held the soap under their noses, inhaling the clean scent. Others ran their fingers over the towel, amazed that it belonged to them personally. Anneliese said, "Do you think they made a mistake?" Marta shook her head. "No, they want us to live like this." Still, the doubt remained. War had taught them that good things rarely came without a reason. A short time later, a soft knock came on the open door. An American sergeant stepped inside, but he stayed close to the entrance. He didn't walk between the bunks. He didn't raise his voice. "Evening, ladies," he said gently. "We brought water for washing. If anyone needs medical help, call the nurse on duty." The women stiffened automatically. A male soldier addressing them was always a moment of fear, but the sergeant kept his eyes focused above their heads, not on their bodies. That alone shocked them. In Europe, many officers looked at women like they were property. Here the man acted as if he respected a boundary. After he left, the women exchanged soft whispers. Did you see how he spoke? He didn't stare at anyone. He didn't act like we were prisoners. As night settled deeper, the women washed using the cool water outside. Some had not washed properly for weeks. Others scrubbed carefully, finally removing the dirt that had clung to their skin since the long marches. They washed in calm silence, grateful for the privacy the Americans gave them. When they returned to the barracks, the atmosphere had changed. The room felt calmer. The shadows from the lanterns created soft golden patches across the wooden walls. The women sat on their bunks, brushing their hair, speaking in low voices. For the first time since their capture, the fear that had followed them for months felt lighter. Not gone, but no longer suffocating. As they prepared to sleep, Marta looked around the barracks again. She noticed small details she had missed earlier. The swept floors, the folded blankets, the open windows letting in cool air. Nothing looked threatening. Nothing felt dangerous. But trust was still far away. When the lights dimmed, the women lay under their blankets, staring at the wooden ceiling. Outside, the camp grew quiet. Only the soft footsteps of guards and the distant hum of nighttime insects filled the air. Anneliese whispered in the darkness, "Do you think tomorrow will be the same?" Marta answered softly, "I don't know, but today showed us something I didn't expect." "What?" "That even in war, people can still treat you like a human being." The barracks fell silent. Some of the women closed their eyes quickly, too exhausted to stay awake. Others lay awake longer, thinking about the day's surprises, the medical care, the respectful tone, the clean water, the personal items, the bed beneath them. None of it matched what they had imagined. It wasn't freedom, it wasn't home, but it wasn't fear either, and that alone made this first night unforgettable. The next morning began quietly. The sun rose over Camp Hearn with a warm golden glow, casting long shadows across the wooden barracks. The German women woke time, and they believed that mercy, when given honestly, could break old ideas. For the German women, this was a shock. They had been told Americans were violent and cruel. They expected beatings, starvation, and humiliation. Instead, they found clean beds, medical care, and warm meals. One of them said later, "Everything I believed about America was broken in one morning." This was the paradox that followed them for the rest of their lives. They came as enemies, but were treated as people. They expected punishment, but received care. They had starved for a week, yet the Americans filled their plates without hesitation. After breakfast, the women were shown around the camp again. They learned they would receive 3 meals a day, opportunities to wash their clothes, and access to basic medical care. They were told they would not be harmed as long as they followed the rules. For many, it was the first moment they felt truly safe since the war began. And over time, the kindness of those first meals changed something inside them. They began to question the world they had come from. They wondered why simple respect had been so rare in their own country. They thought about their families, their villages, and the leaders who had pushed them into a war that left them starving and afraid. Weeks later, one of the older women said, "We lost our nation, but here we found our humanity again." As the months passed, the women grew stronger. Their faces filled out. Their walking no longer showed exhaustion. They began helping in the camp kitchens, gardens, and sewing rooms. The Americans trusted them more. The women trusted the Americans too. Little by little, the memory of that first meal, the shock, the tears, the relief, became a symbol. It reminded them that the war was ending. It reminded them that not all nations fought with cruelty. It reminded them that mercy could be powerful. Years later, when they returned to Germany, many told the same story. They told their children and grandchildren about the day American soldiers fed them warm food after a week of starvation. They told how they cried into their plates because they finally felt human again. And that became the legacy. They had come to America as prisoners. They left as witnesses to a truth they had never in a seat slowly, as if the chairs might disappear. The Americans moved around the room, placing plates in front of them. Everything was served gently, without force or impatience. It was simple food, but to the German women, it felt like a feast. Marta took a small bite of bread. Her hands shook. She hadn't tasted fresh bread in months. "It's soft," she murmured. Anneliese ate her oatmeal carefully. "My stomach forgot what warm food felt like." Some of the women cried quietly, trying to hide their tears so no one would think they were weak. But the emotion was too strong. After starving for days, after losing their homes, after walking through war zones, a normal breakfast felt like a miracle. One woman later wrote in her diary, "I had forgotten what it meant to feel full. I had forgotten what it meant to be treated kindly." The Americans watched, but didn't stare. They understood what hunger did to a person. During the war, the US Army provided more than 4,000 calories a day to its soldiers, meals designed to keep men strong. They knew the difference food could make. When the women finished eating, the room felt different. Their shoulders were no longer pulled tight. They spoke in soft voices. They began to believe the camp might truly be a safe place. But this meal meant more than just food. It meant survival. It meant dignity. It meant the war was no longer the only thing shaping their days. The officers at Camp Hearn had a purpose. They wanted to show that prisoners would be treated fairly under the Geneva Convention. They wanted to prove that justice could exist even in wartime, and they believed that mercy, when given honestly, could break old ideas. For the German women, this was a shock. They had been told Americans were violent and cruel. They expected beatings, starvation, and humiliation. Instead, they found clean beds, medical care, and warm meals. One of them said later, "Everything I believed about America was broken in one morning." This was the paradox that followed them for the rest of their lives. They came as enemies, but were treated as people. They expected punishment, but received care. They had starved for a week, yet the Americans filled their plates without hesitation. After breakfast, the women were shown around the camp again. They learned they would receive 3 meals a day, opportunities to wash their clothes, and access to basic medical care. They were told they would not be harmed as long as they followed the rules. For many, it was the first imagined. This wasn't propaganda, this was real. And sometimes the strongest weapon in war isn't force, it's humanity. In the end, they understood something larger than their own suffering. They learned that nations are remembered not only for how they fight, but for how they treat the powerless. In the end, the story of these German women at Camp Hearn is more than a memory of war. It is proof that even in the darkest moments, simple acts of kindness can change a life. A warm meal, a clean bed, a respectful voice. These things broke fear faster than any weapon could. They arrived believing America was their enemy. They left understanding that humanity can appear where you least expect it. If this story moved you, if it showed you a side of World War II that history books often overlook, then stay with us. There are many more hidden stories, quiet moments of courage, compassion, and truth that deserve to be told. Subscribe, share this video, and help keep these forgotten voices alive.